PlayStation has been going under what I can only call a transformative period as of late. After some high-profile flops like Concord and the constant battle between Sony's core titles from an ideological perspective, it's clear that something has to change and is changing in the future. So today, I want to talk PlayStation, Naughty Dog specifically for most of it, and the creator Neil Druckmann, who kind of embodies everything that is plenty wrong with how Western game development has gone and how his next title, Intergalactic: The Heretic Prophet, just might be his biggest attack on one of the oldest religions in the world, that being Christianity. To start at the beginning, it's clear that Western games and their ideological pushes have not worked. I referenced this piece from a friend of the channel, Francesco Solback of That Park Place. He's been in some of my streams and edited a few videos of mine as well, and his article is titled, Inside Sony's Internal Battle, a look at the East-West clash dividing Sony and the gaming industry. Francesco details how, based on his insider sources, which he has told me things in the past which I've relayed to all of you in many of my videos already, that Sony is being restructured behind the scenes. It's all being done by what's called the Samurai Elite. These are the top dogs at Sony. These Japanese men are the top of their echelons when it comes to business and all that sort of stuff, and they've noticed how their gaming division, PlayStation, has been mired in clear ideological warfare for a while now. And I think it's safe to say that the PlayStation 5's life cycle has definitely resulted in less actual hit games as stuff like Concord exists, not to mention all the cancelled multiplayer games from a Last of Us Online game and even a God of War live service game being axed as well. And of course, I can't not bring up Hermen Hulst, who used to run Guerrilla Games, which made Horizon, and how much he has pushed Horizon onto players as he tried to make it into some Last of Us success with LEGO spin-offs and pointless remasters and remakes. Although at least the engine that Horizon runs on, which is called Decima, is a genuinely great engine to build games on. In case you didn't know, Hideo Kojima's Death Stranding series runs on that same engine, and he purposely chose that engine after touring Sony's various first-party studios, trying to find the engine that he wanted to use for his games in the future, so don't get it twisted. Good or even great games are still coming to PlayStation. I'm personally very excited for Death Stranding 2 myself. But I can't shake the feeling that there's still this ideology nonsense that is rotting out Sony regardless on their Western fronts. As Francesco states here in his article, many of Sony's first-party offerings have had dwindling success. The Last of Us Part 2 sold 40% less than the first game did, moving 10 million copies against the original 17 million. Even Spider-Man 2 sold 69%, nice, less copies than the original. And coincidentally, when you compare Spider-Man 1 to 2, the wokeness, for lack of a better word, is all over that game that was barely present in the original. And Horizon's sequel sold only 8 million against Zero Dawn's 20 million. So, what the hell is going on? The problem is that Sony's original approach used to work wonders when making games. In case you don't know, Sony tends to have a rather hands-off approach when it comes to what their first-party studios make. Sure, they may make some demands, but generally speaking, as Neil Druckmann of Naughty Dog has confirmed in the past, Sony kind of just believes whatever their creators make will sell, cause their creativity is what the players want. And back in the PS2, PS3, or most of even the PS4 era, this was true. There were all kinds of games of various genres being made, but from the late PS4 going into the PS5 era, this did start to change. Coincidentally, this coincided when ESG, or Economic, Social, and Governance funds, began to infiltrate the industry en masse. Which is how you got the slop you got from Concord, Suicide Squad, Dustboard, and more. Big money influxes promised to studios to use to make their games, as long as they hired and implemented people of color into leadership roles not based on merit, but simply on their identity alone. This practice has absolutely rotted out other companies like Ubisoft too. Look at their games for the past 5 years and then some, most of it has failed. And now they're resorting to Microsoft to save them as Tencent circles them like a hungry shark. I did a whole video prior to this one about that very topic. But this now brings me to Naughty Dog and specifically Neil Druckmann. In case you somehow don't know, Neil is a Jewish man. He has made it evidently clear that his Jewish heritage has had many influences on his games. And there's nothing wrong with that either. I mean, every game or movie made will have the influences of the people who are leading those ships through the waters of creation. I have no issue with that. It makes sense that of course Neil's heritage would show up in his work. It's why in Last of Us Part 2, There's an entire part where Ellie and Dina, by the way Dina is also Jewish because Neil wanted her to be, visit a synagogue while they're on their journey to find Abby and the others, and here's a clip of that.
Hey, Ellie. This place is a synagogue.
How can you tell?
One, there are menorah decorations on the wall. It's a Jewish thing. And two, I didn't burst into flames just now, so...
Burst into flames?
It's just a dumb joke.
Oh, unlike your other ones.
You shut it. This place brings back a lot of memories. My sister used to drag me to a synagogue all the time.
You never struck me as much of a believer.
Nah, but I like coming from a long line of survivors.
You mean after Outbreak Day?
That, and the Inquisition, and the Holocaust. My family always made it out alive. Barely.
Neil makes a point to show that Dina being Jewish is an allegory with the Holocaust being used as something to compare to the outbreak of cordyceps, and how the zombies have overrun the planet killing everyone. It's a novel idea to compare the two, but again, this was obviously added because Neil is Jewish. Another video does show that Neil also made it very clear to his developers that nothing within this synagogue could be desecrated either. Check this out. As you can see, it's impossible to open fire on anything related to the ancestry of Jewish individuals in Last of Us Part 2. Interesting, isn't it? I also found it interesting that one of the two main villain factions of the game, if you will, are the Seraphites, or Scars as they're usually called in-game. Those are the people in the ponchos and jackets that are running around the woods shooting arrows at Ellie, and it's the same faction that Lev, who joins Abby, is a part of as well, originally. And Lev's story, by the way, is that she's a young girl who runs away from the Scars because she doesn't want to be a child bride to an elder Scar member. Lev is also transgender and wants to be a boy, but this is obviously not allowed in Scar's culture. It's very, very obvious that Neil Druckmann took what he perceived as Christianity, something that is not necessarily aligned with his upbringing, and decided to then make it a villainous faction within his zombie game. And I'm not the only one who noticed this, since back when The Last of Us Part 2 released, Vice had this article come out around that time titled "The Not-So-Hidden Israeli Politics of The Last of Us Part 2." Let me read you some of this excellent article, and I quote, "The Last of Us Part 2 focuses on what has been broadly defined by some of its creators as a cycle of violence. While some zombie fiction shows human depravity in response to fear or scarcity in the immediate aftermath of an outbreak, The Last of Us Part 2 takes place in a more stabilized post-apocalypse, decades after societal collapse, where individuals and communities choose to hurt each other as opposed to taking heinous actions out of desperation. More specifically, the cycle of violence in The Last of Us Part 2 appears to be largely modeled after the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I suspect that some players, if they consciously clock the parallels at all, will think The Last of Us Part 2 is taking a balanced and fair perspective on that conflict, humanizing and exposing flaws in both sides of its in-game analogs. But as someone who grew up in Israel, I recognized a familiar, firmly Israeli way of seeing and explaining the conflict, which tries to appear even-handed and even enlightened, but in practice marginalizes Palestinian experience in a manner that perpetuates a horrific status quo. The game's co-director and co-writer Neil Druckmann, an Israeli who was born and raised in the West Bank before his family moved to the United States, told the Washington Post that the game's themes of revenge can be traced back to the 2000 killing of 2 Israeli soldiers by a mob in Ramallah. Some of the gruesome details of the incident were captured on video, which Druckmann viewed. In his interview, he recounted the anger and desire for vengeance that he felt when he saw the video and how he later reconsidered and regretted those impulses, saying they made him feel gross and guilty, but it gave him the kernel of a story. I landed on this emotional idea of, can we, over the course of the game, make you feel this intense hate that is universal, In the same way that unconditional love is universal, Druckmann told Washington Post. This hate that people feel has the same kind of universality. You hate someone so much that you want them to suffer in the way they've made someone you love suffer. That's what this story is about. Do the ends justify the means? And it's so much about perspective. If it was to save a strange kid, maybe Joel would have made a very different decision, but when it was his tribe, his daughter, there was no question about what he was going to do, Druckmann said, end quote. As you can see, when you see things through this lens, The Last of Us Part 2 is undoubtedly a very political game that tries to put the player in the shoes of both sides of a real-life conflict, but obviously through the lens of a video game. Even the first barrier that Ellie and Dina arrive at when reaching Seattle looks very familiar to the West Bank barrier, where Neil Druckmann was born, as you're now seeing on screen. And Druckmann also implements the reversal of how Palestinian freedom fighters would skirt around Israel in the game too. In real life, the Palestinians would use tunnels under cities to get around, but in The Last of Us 2, the Seraphites, or Scars, use skyscraper bridges way up in the clouds to avoid detection from enemy factions. Same idea, but it tracks. Vice's article here, which honestly is probably one of the best written articles when it comes to game journalism of the past 5 years, and no, I'm not kidding, expertly breaks down how Neil Druckmann very obviously tries to paint his side of the aisle, that of Israel, in a more sympathetic light over that of Palestine. Is this all political? Very unfortunately so, and it's all over The Last of Us Part 2, where the characters you play are but avenues for you to enact murderous hatred upon others who are supposedly supposed to be The Last of Us versions of Palestinians, basically. And when you view this through this new lens, when you play as Ellie, I can't even show the more gruesome depictions in this video without fear of age restriction or whatever else, unfortunately, from YouTube, but Ellie just straight up kills people all over this game. She even at one point stabs a pregnant woman, ending her life and the baby's. And look, I'm all for games and movies and whatnot, not shying away from violence and showing things how they would be, but it's very clear that Neil Druckmann had a very clear agenda with this game when he made it. It's not even like with The Last of Us Part 2's story ending that there's any real conclusive resolution to the conflict. By the end of the game, everyone is worse having experienced what happens in the story. Nobody comes out 100%, and the bigger factions like the Wolves and Scars literally end up in flames pretty much by the end of it. The cycle of violence, so to speak, never ends, and it's alluded that the Fireflies from the first game are now banding together by the time the credits roll. Thus, the people that Joel wronged in the first game are now getting stronger again, and thus, the cycle of violence continues. And the violence of man, like the hubris of every flawed individual on this planet, is sempiternal. It will just repeat over and over again and again, until eventually there is nothing left but cold blood of what was once people who lived there. To say that The Last of Us didn't go over well with fans, that would be an understatement. What they did to Joel especially was egregious. And the ending of the game genuinely pissed off many people because it seemed pretty pointless in the end. Although in my opinion, the way that Part 2 ends with Ellie's revenge not being actualized is very similar in some ways to Part 1's ending. Let me explain. Where Joel, despite killing however many people and going on this journey with Ellie, ends up just kind of wiping out the very people they were seeking because they wanted to harm the one thing that Joel had left that made his life living in this world worth it, which is Ellie. But whereas Part 1's ending had justification for Joel's actions, and I genuinely do believe that what Joel did was not a wrong thing to do, especially if you took the time to read some of the notes in the game. You'll realize that the Fireflies had tried to make a cure from other immune individuals in the past, and they failed many times. Basically, a cure to the virus was impossible, pretty much, and Ellie would have simply been yet another life pointlessly lost in the pursuit of mankind's so-called salvation. But what I found incredibly poignant about the first game was that despite the journey technically in a sense some would argue being for nothing, that the game made the argument that despite there being good in the world, that humanity at large was not worth saving at all really anyways. All humanity does is kill, steal, and destroy itself. You don't even need the second game to come into this conclusion. Take one look at the environments of Last of Us 1 and you will see it all over. Nobody sees you as a friend, but you're only a threat, and it's clear that despite mankind's need to exist, that nature ultimately is doing fine without the presence of humanity at all. Vegetation has taken over the world. Vines wrap around stores once filled with people, as if Mother Nature is retaking the planet from its oppressors almost. My ultimate realization at the end of Last of Us Part 1 was simple. Joel did what he did, not because it was right or wrong of him, but simply because that he came to the solution that if the surgery was successful, let's say, what happens then? The Fireflies would have a trump card in their hands, able to control entire factions and groups because they had the cure to the infection. They had, in a sense, defeated their creator, not God, but nature, with the ingenuity of science and the countless people they killed to reach their goal. And in that moment, when Joel saw what could be, he didn't see humanity's salvation. He instead saw a beast that was growing in size, becoming nothing but the next big threat that would immediately dwarf the infection and replace it. Because what can an infection do when the alternative would have guns, Molotovs, and God forbid chemical warfare or worse, and immunity to the infection too? And in my opinion, the ultimate lesson of Last of Us 1, and really even 2, is that humanity is just not worth saving in the end. And that the world would, objectively, be better without any of us being in it. But whereas Part 1's story felt poignant, Part 2's story ended feeling hollow and ultimately meaningless. And I think this meaninglessness, or however you want to say it, is why so many people felt as if the journey was genuinely pointless the entire way through. Because Ellie kills so many not Palestinian people only to let Abby go. It's kind of moronic. Why would you stop at the one person who started this? When you think about it critically, none of it made any sense. Saying that it wouldn't change anything is stupid. If someone killed my mom and I was in that world, I would erase their entire bloodline myself. The idea that revenge is bad is stupid. Those are just the words of someone who would rather lay on their back and let their enemies have their way with them. It's ridiculous to me. And this is why Part 2's ending was dog water in my opinion. Sure, the game ran well, looked great, played really well too. All of that is nice. But the story does fumble its meaning and ending so badly that it retroactively made the rest of the game, and kind of the first game too, worse because of it existing. And this overtly political angle to not only The Last of Us, but video games in general, has completely submerged the Western way of making games. This then exhaustingly brings me to Intergalactic: The Heretic Prophet, which is quickly showing that Neil Druckmann, despite the response to The Last of Us 2, has decided to double down on his political views going forward. So during a Sony-sponsored interview, Neil Druckmann sat down with Alex Garland, that's the director of 28 Days Later, you know, the zombie movie series. They got a new one coming out. Anyways, these two are speaking about all kinds of things. Near the later half of the interview, Alex Garland and Neil Druckmann get into Neil's next project, Intergalactic. I could explain it to you, but I'll let Neil speak for himself. Hopefully Sony doesn't copyright this being in here, but please watch it.
Project at Naughty Dog for 4 years now. We just announced it. It's called Intergalactic: The Heretic Prophet. It's our venture into more sci-fi stuff.
What kind of sci-fi? Like, I mean, obviously I know you, but is it like, you talking deep space? Are you talking about, is it Earthbound?
It's not Earthbound. It takes place 2,000 years in an alternate future that deviates in the late 80s.
Wow.
And we spent like years just coming up with that timeline. And it's dealing with, it's funny, it's like, I joke about this with the team. It's like, oh, we made a game with The Last of Us 2. We made certain creative decisions. That got us a lot of hate. A lot of people love it, but a lot of people hate that game.
Who gives a shit?
Exactly. So the joke is like, you know what, let's do something that people won't care as much about. Let's make a game about faith and religion. So there is just, we not only in this alternate history timeline, we've made this, where the timeline deviates, this new religion becomes pretty prominent. And then we spend years just building out this religion of like from the original prophet all the way how it gets like changed and sometimes bastardized and evolves over all these years. And then like all these people from this...
How many, you said 2,000 years?
2,000.
Coincidentally, 2,000 years?
Coincidentally, 2,000 and this whole religion takes place on this one planet, and then at one point, all communication stops from this planet.
Nice.
And you're playing a bounty hunter that's chasing her bounty, and she crash lands on this planet. And it's and I really wanted to make a game about faith and religion, but also about
this. It sounds
just being
awesome.
lonely. So many of the previous games we've done, there's always like an ally with you, and you're talking. I was like, I really want you to be lost in a place that you're really confused about what happened here. Who are the people here? What was their history? And in order to get off this planet, like, again, no one has been heard from this planet for 600 years. So if you ever have hoped to have a chance to get off, you have to figure out what happened here.
As you hopefully see, if it's still in the video as Neil described, Intergalactic will be about a bounty hunter landing on a planet called Semperia to find her bounty, and it hasn't been contacted in 600 years, yet notice when Alex and Neil are talking that Neil says his story takes place in an alternate history, where this religion veers in a different direction and specifically states that this religion began roughly 2,000 years prior to when Intergalactic takes place. And look at how Alex Garland reacted to this information when he says this.
How many? You said 2,000 years?
2000.
Coincidentally, 2,000 years?
Coincidentally, 2000.
2000 exactly. Yeah, Alex knows. Neil is talking about Christianity. So Neil is taking something that he doesn't agree with and was taught was evil growing up, which is Christianity, and he's basically going to be using it as a bludgeoning tool, to use it to make his sci-fi adventure game, which means when the main character of this game, whose name is Jordan Munn, arrives on Semperia, she will absolutely run into plenty of religious brutality, all being done in some weird, distorted version of Christianity through the eyes of a creator who loathes it. And I think in the current media climate we're in with, Trump winning, wokeness dying, all of that, the last thing that Sony needs is a game that will objectively be making the religion of the very people who are sick of these things now seen as the enemy in a mega big budget AAA game that will be forced down players' throats at events and more. It's going to be insufferable, is what it's going to be. And the fact that despite the failure of Last of Us 2 from a sales and fan perspective, that Neil has clearly learned nothing and has now instead decided to double down in the face of opposition instead. Even that Park Place mentions in their article that Neil Druckmann chose the 1980s as the point in which his new story diverges from. Coincidentally, by the way, the 1980s was when there was a notable mainstream rise in conservative Christian faith within media and the world abroad, and that he uses the word bastardized specifically in his description of this religion that he won't name that he's covering in Intergalactic should tell you everything that you need to know.
All the way how it gets change and sometimes bastardized and evolves over all these years.
Neil Druckmann is about to beat the player over the head with his anti-Christian hammer, and you will buy the game and be glad you played it too. I've also been told in the past by sources that Neil Druckmann's studio is just hellbent on pushing anti-Christian pro-woke beliefs in their games going forward. And they are, according to my sources, willing to just bet the livelihood of the studio itself in pushing these ideas out into the world. Neil Druckmann, unfortunately, has become so brazen he's willing to spend the hundreds of millions of dollars that Sony lends him to essentially turn his games into genuine propaganda. And if people think someone like Neil isn't going to not do that, they are frankly stupid. The Last of Us Part 2 was the first game from the ground up that Neil genuinely spearheaded himself from the beginning. The first game wasn't even directed by him. Bruce Straley did that, in case you didn't know. Sure, Neil also did Uncharted 4. But again, the bones of that game's story and its world were already designed by both Bruce Straley and Amy Hennig before they left the studio. Which means the only game that Neil Druckmann has made where he, and he alone, was in the driver's seat was The Last of Us Part 2. And it's interesting that once he was left to his own devices without the people who could rein him in the past are no longer there, and then he ends up making one of the most politically charged video games of the past decade that angers fans, alienates them, spits on their loyalty, and also has the audacity to say that they're wrong and cry victim about it like he did in that Sony interview recently. And the more he reveals about Intergalactic, the more it seems like the plot of that game truly will be what was leaked a few months ago. To paraphrase it quickly, if the leak is true, Intergalactic will be about these aliens who are actually just basically space Palestinians. Instead of being non-Christian scarred weirdos who shoot arrows from trees and whatever and try to force children to be brides like in The Last of Us Part 2. And like I said, every creator to some degree will indeed inject their personal beliefs, life experiences, and then some into their work. That is inevitable. But it's obvious that Neil Druckmann is hell-bent on pushing some weird what he stands for, reject everything else ideology no matter the cost. Then Doug TenNapel, the creator of Earthworm Jim and a vocal conservative man, said this about Intergalactic and Naughty Dog. I knew the Naughty Dog and Insomniac guys when the company started, and they were solid gamers, not secularist pseudo philosophers taking passive-aggressive bitchy pot shots at Christianity. As administrators and human resources grow in companies, they all merge to the left. That goes for American universities and hospitals too. Most were started by conservative Christians, then turned into woke, totalitarian institutions that don't produce the quality of yesteryear. Conservative people of faith don't need to create a parallel market, we need to create a viable market where games are rooted in merit of gameplay, not philosophy of the owners or the cinematics tacked on at the end. And I agree with Doug here. It's so obvious that the western side of Sony has completely succumbed themselves to the woke monolith of how to do things now. And it's become so ingrained in their DNA that they're unable to make games that are just for fun first. Because why make a fun video game when you can sell the player a lecture disguised as a $70 product instead that could, in theory, turn them to your side in the future and could inevitably also lead to more works that push what you believe to be right. Like I said in the beginning of this video, those samurai elite at Sony, as they're called, have already begun to organize PlayStation their way from the top to the bottom. And I frankly don't see these sorts of projects becoming the norm in the future. Sure, Intergalactic is too far into development now to scrap, and Ghost of Yote might be insufferable too, but I mean, key people also left Sucker Punch as well, so Yote is kind of being ran under new management, and yeah, it shows alright. But this bludgeoning tool mentality is no longer effective. People are onto things like this, and if Neil Druckmann is willing to destroy the future of Naughty Dog financially, and ruin the goodwill of its player base for the awards that'll be given to him by other like-minded communist weirdos, who too think that the players are all racist and bigots, then that's exactly what's going to happen. I know this video was long, but what do you think about all of this? Let me know in the comments. Apologies for getting a bit more political than I usually do, but in this case, it was kind of inevitable. Thank you for watching, subscribe, I hope you learned something today. Always think for yourselves, question everything, and I'll see you again.